Newsline. News First, Newsline.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsline. Now, besides the troubles that you and I are facing here in Sri Lanka, a lot is going on globally. If you haven't heard of, especially the war between Russia and Ukraine is still ongoing. There was a lot of opposition to this war and a lot of doomsday stories at the beginning of this war. But with the progression of time, as what happens always, people tend to forget because they are already stuck with their own problems. And that seems to be the case as far as the Russia-Ukraine war goes. And don't forget, just because the war is happening between Russia and Ukraine does not mean that we here in Sri Lanka have no effect of it. This has affected the cost of living, the price of wheat, and an escalation in this war that would lead to this turning out to be another world war of sorts could have dire consequences on each and every one of us. And therefore, it's important that we stay up to date on what really is happening. To discuss these matters and more, we've got with us today Nilanthan Niruthan, the Director for Center of Law and Warfare, also known as CLAW. Very good evening, Nilanthan, and welcome to the show.
Hi, Shalan. It's good to see you again.
So, Nilanthan, could you give us a little bit of an update of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine? We know that both sides are bombarding each other. Hundreds of thousands of people are dying, but we don't know how many have died because neither side is releasing accurate information. Of course, it's expected only. You don't want to say that you have suffered so many losses and you are losing the war. So, Nilanthan, with your expertise in this field of warfare, what really is happening in Russia and Ukraine?
So, Shalan, I think the best way for us to decode what's going on there is simply to look at what's being reported, because as you said, there's no way we would ever get a reliable estimate of things like death rate and casualty rate and things like that, right? But let's just look at some of the things that we do know right now. First of all, the Ukrainian counter-offensive that the Ukrainian government has been promising for about 1.5 years now, almost. I mean, it's 15 months in the making.
The spring offensive, is it?
As in retaking the Russian territories, as in the Ukrainian territories that were taken over by Russia last year. That has still not materialized. That counter-attack has still not materialized. The Ukrainians keep promising that it's coming the next week or the next month or whatever it is. That's not happened. However, there are certain signs at the moment that this counter-attack will finally materialize, right? So that's one thing. We are living in a very interesting phase in this war, where for the first time we are seeing somewhat tangible evidence that the final promised counter-attack by the Ukrainians is on the way. However, maybe they're tricking us again, right? Who knows? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second is that from Russia's perspective, they have changed their tactics a lot. So if you look at their assault on Kiev when the war first started, as you know, their initial objective was to take over Kiev in a couple of days. They thought they could just storm in there and take their entire place under their control, like what they've done in many other territories. However, that hasn't materialized. What they're doing now is essentially using mass-scale drone strikes. And there have been about 15 mass-scale attacks on Kiev just this month alone, where huge amounts of drones are sent in to attack civilian centers. And this is very interesting because, number one, it shows that the Russians are kind of worried about losing more military personnel, because a lot of sources indicate that even many top-level Russian members of the Air Force were wiped out in the disastrous first attempt to take over Kiev. You know, as you know, Shalan, things like tanks, which cost hundreds of millions of dollars, were countered by Molotov cocktails that you and I could probably make with the ingredients available in this room, right? So the Russians have sort of learned that their conventional superiority is perhaps not going to work, and that they have to resort to tactics like this, because it's usually the smaller groups that attack the larger groups this way. So what Russia is doing to Ukraine now is almost like what the Palestinians do to the Israelis, where they keep firing in hundreds of cheap rockets into Israeli territory, and it then becomes Israel's job to counter that. So that's usually done by the weaker side on the smaller side. So it's interesting to see Russia, this major global power, having to resort to that because of the kind of sophisticated anti-air sort of weaponry that Ukraine is now equipped with. That's one. That's the second point. The third point is that in terms of the international diplomatic front, Russia is also feeling the heat of Ukraine's aggressive foreign policy, in the sense that the Russian foreign minister has been on this huge African diplomacy mission this last week, and that is to counter Ukraine's diplomacy in Africa, right? So we see this almost culminating in yesterday's sort of announcement that Ukraine was going to support sanctions against Iran. And everybody knows that the reason Ukraine is doing that is to kind of curry favor with the people whom they are hoping will help them, because geopolitically, Ukraine and Iran have nothing to do with each other than that Iran is somewhat of an ally of Russia, and that Ukraine is a strong ally of the United States. But Ukraine has a history of doing this, and it's often really backfired on them. For example, if you remember, when India conducted its nuclear tests, the country at the forefront trying to ban that and trying to punish India for it through international organizations was Ukraine. And Indians were generally, their response was, what problem do they have with this? Why would they be at the forefront of this? We had absolutely nothing to do with them. But obviously, it was not Ukraine's decision to be at the forefront, right? Ukraine was basically a proxy for other geopolitical powers involved. So Ukraine has a history of doing this. The final point that we need to keep in mind before we can pivot it into whatever direction you want to take this into is this notion that there is a ticking clock in some senses for both nations, right? As in, for Ukraine, it's the idea of the counter-offensive. And for Russia, it's the idea of how they might prepare for whatever it is this counteroffensive is. Because obviously, it will not be Ukrainian weaponry and Ukrainian technology that will play a pivotal role in the counteroffensive. It's been 15 months now, and they've been planning it. And trust me, Russian military equipment, for all their sort of fame and hype and all that, in an actual confrontation with the American military industrial complex, or whatever you want to call it, they would get completely wiped out. I mean, we saw what happened to Russian tanks and Russian jets and all that. And with the American decision to now supply Ukraine with F-16s, that will be a complete game changer. Of course, the F-16s will not arrive early enough to be a part of the current counteroffensive that the Ukrainians are promising, but it will be a huge game changer, because Russian fighter craft will simply not be able to handle the F-16, which is arguably the deadliest single-engine fighter aircraft in the world, right? It's not as good as the F-22, but the F-16 is still formidable enough to completely change the air power equation there. So if we look at a city like Bakhmut in Ukraine, which has been the site of the longest and bloodiest battles ever since this entire conflict started, over the last few days, there have been reports that the Russians have toned down on their intensity. Why? Because the Russians are also anticipating that the counteroffensive is finally on its way, and that they need to kind of consolidate at the moment. It's almost like the calm before the storm at this point. But I would rather phrase it as a ticking time bomb, because you never know when they might backfire. Because with the Ukraine-India example that I gave you earlier, India would have been an invaluable ally to Ukraine at this point, because India would have been a major non-Western power that was ideologically backing Ukraine. As we discussed in my last conversation with you, I think about a year ago, one of the big sort of foreign policy failures of the West with the whole Russia-Ukraine war has been their inability to get any major non-Western country to denounce the Russians. Despite all the belligerent sort of you're either with us or you're a Russian terrorist type diplomacy that the Ukrainians and the Western alliance were pushing all over the world, Saudi Arabia, they initially took up a bit of a position where they would vote yes here, abstain here, but overall they've done nothing in terms of what they were expected to do. India has done nothing. China has done nothing. So many of the major non-Western powers have done nothing, and it's backfired on Ukraine. So similarly, for us, we need to simply see this as the consequences. And what we need to learn from here is not to trust too many allies who tell you that they will have your back. Because this is what large countries do to small countries. And this is the lesson we as Sri Lankans need to learn. Large countries will wind us up for their own interests. They will assure us that they have our backs. But when push comes to shove, as they say, if we could use that cliche, we will be left fending for ourselves. So our only position on this has to be, let's learn from this and let's not make the mistakes that the Ukraine.
So, Nilanthan, are you saying that the West is not supporting the Ukraine as much as they should, or as much as they could, or as much as they promised?
Yes, the Ukrainians were convinced that the West would actually send in soldiers. Initially, they were convinced. If you look at Zelensky's rhetoric before the conflict broke out, the Ukrainians were completely convinced that there would be direct involvement either through NATO troops or through other powers that were working in ancillary ways. But they simply, for whatever reason, did not understand that if a conflict broke out like this, the major powers are more than happy to wave your flag and cheer you on and send you off to die, and they might give you money and arms. But ultimately, if you expect them to be on the front lines with you, that happens in very, very few cases. Even you're a treaty ally, as Ukraine thought it was, and it turns out that NATO simply said, sorry, you're not a part of NATO, and therefore there's nothing that we can do. So it's been a huge, huge disappointment for Ukraine. And we can see this if we just go back and look at the speeches and interviews that were being given by Ukrainian leaders when the war first started and just before that.
Well, Nilanthan, as I said at the beginning of the show, this war has consequences not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire world. Some of those consequences or the dire nature of those consequences are being seen now with many European countries going into recession, with the US almost about to default on their debt. And also, of course, here in Sri Lanka with the aggravated nature of the economic crisis. We'll discuss the effects of the Russia-Ukraine war on the world and especially on Sri Lanka after this short commercial break. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Newsline.
News First, Newsline.
A disappointed Vimala Veera says he is no longer prepared to remain idle in the government.
හැබැයි මේ ඇමති මණ්ඩලේ ඉන්නවා පුබ්බඩෝ කීප දෙනෙක්. එක් ඇමති මණ්ඩලේ ඉන්නවා පුබ්බඩෝ කීප දෙනෙක්. ඒ පුබ්බඩොත් එක්ක මට පස්සේ අපිට උඩින් ඉන්නවා පියාට්ටා කරන්න උණු පුබ්බඩෝ.
Former SLPP MP reveals of a deadline given to provide ministries.
කැබිනට් ඇමතිකන් දෙන්න නැත්තම් දවස් 15ක් ඇතුළත අනිවාර්යයෙන්ම ඒ 50 දෙනෙකුත් අරගෙන ආණ්ඩුවේ 50 දෙනෙකුත් අරගෙන විපක්ෂේ වාඩි වෙනවා.
Government claims whenever attempts are made to uplift the country, certain groups and clans attempt to destabilize those efforts. Civil groups question whether Broadcasting Authority Bill is being presented to suppress the media. Trade unions launched new struggle to protect the EPF and ETF. Chennai Super Kings claim IPL championship for a 5th time.
When a heart attack strikes, every minute makes the difference between life and death. With the right care and treatment at the hand of the most skilled surgeons and medical professionals. With the perfect environment for recovery. Darden's Heart Centre, dedicated to you.
News First, Newsline.
Hello there, and welcome back to Newsline. We're in discussion with Nilanthan Niruthan, the Director for the Center for Law and Warfare, also known as CLAW. Nilanthan, we were speaking about the Russia-Ukraine war. This is one of the biggest wars that the world has seen since the end of the Second World War. Now, many people who are really alive right now wouldn't have gone through the horrors of the Second World War. Yes, we read them. Yes, we see movies about them. But all of those accounts are biased to a certain way. But the horrors still remain the same. And we are seeing, well, somewhat of those horrors in Russia and Ukraine. But then again, with the lack of information from the war front between those two countries, as you quite rightly mentioned at the beginning, we are only getting very limited information. Now, Nilanthan, the effects of this war, much has been spoken about it, the effects to the world. But let's first start off here in Sri Lanka. Now, at the beginning of the economic crisis, there were those who said, look, this economic crisis is coming against a backdrop where this war has taken place, and that has had a massive effect. In fact, that is part and parcel, a large percentage of the reason why Sri Lanka is facing an economic crisis. Is the effect of the Russia-Ukraine war that dire here in Sri Lanka?
So it's perhaps not that dire here when you sort of compare what's going on in, for example, Europe, for instance. However, it would be kind of hard for us to say that there's no impact either, isn't it? Because in some way or the other, there will be impact. So, for example, let's look at the strategic side of it, on which I can give you one or two actual examples through which Sri Lanka would be affected. So, as you know, ever since the sort of counterinsurgency campaign against the LTT and that ended, and we moved on from that and all that, there's been a huge internal debate in our own country about the sort of whether the international, quote unquote, international community is something that we need to work with, or whether the international community is something that we need to be a bit suspicious of, right? And in terms of the lessons that we learn from the Russia-Ukraine conflict, strategically, I think this has to push us to once again examine that debate, because a lot of people seem to think that that debate's over, because as you know, depending on which political party is in power here, depending on which political party is popular here, the consensus would either be, oh, the international community is evil, or the consensus would be, oh, we need to be plugged into the international community. So strategically, that debate will have to be revisited here. Another strategic lesson that we need to learn, or the strategic impact that this will have on us, is that it will make a lot of countries start looking for non-American, non-Russian alternatives in terms of moving forward economically. Because the big winner of this economic, I wouldn't say the biggest winner is India, right? But as we look at the economic data pouring in, a very interesting fact is that India has somehow managed to insulate itself from this major global downturn that's going on right now. The Indian economy is simply not being affected the way that a lot of people thought it would be. A big bunch of it is because of Narendra Modi's kind of emphasis on building up local industries and things like that. And because India has somehow been saved from this, there will be a positive strategic and economic impact for Sri Lanka as well. Because when one country starts rising through the sort of ladder, so to speak, the ancillary countries in that sphere of interest will also face a lot of benefits. I mean, look at what happened to Canada after the United States became a geopolitical power, right? Canada is quite inconsequential, or was quite inconsequential geopolitically until very recently. But the fact that they were neighbors with the largest economic power in the world, and the fact that they were friendly neighbors with the largest economic power in the world, turned out to be great for Canada, where Canada's rise was essentially almost a residual effect of US hegemony. So that way, India's insulation from this global downturn will be of a positive nature in terms of the economic impact for us.
But Nilanthan, now moving forward with how this war will progress, of course, you spoke about an offensive from part of the Ukrainians. Of course, there will be many more operations conducted by the Russians trying to move further into Ukrainian territory. So with an end to this war not being in sight, do you think the prolonged nature of this war will have a worse effect on Sri Lanka in the future?
I wouldn't say so, because typically when we look at wars that wage on for a period of many, many years, as we've seen. So, for example, if you look at the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, which spanned about 10 years, after the first 2 or 3 years, things kind of tend to balance themselves out. People find alternatives, and slowly you find the economically, strategically, things I can either get very good or very bad, even in the long run. But economically, typically countries start to find alternatives and things like that. And as I was saying, this region, of course, Pakistan is unfortunately not in a good economic position, but India is, and there will be alternatives that are found. So I would once again emphasize that the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on Sri Lanka is far more strategic than economic, because the economic consequences are negligent compared to our existing economic problems, right? But strategically, there will be tangible effects.
When you say strategically there will be tangible issues, what do you mean, Nilanthan?
So, for example, as I was saying, in terms of the efficacy of the international community, in terms of the way in which large powers do their power calculations on what they can use the smaller powers for, because there will be UN resolutions, international resolutions that will come up. So there will be countries who want us to vote either in favor or against us. There will be consequences for us picking one side or the other. There's going to be a lot of geopolitical negotiation going back and forth. And as you know, small countries often, if they play the game smart, small countries can get a lot out of it. So in terms of things like that, I do see us hopefully being able to exploit this here.
Nilanthan, also here in Sri Lanka, when you look at how the geopolitical situation in Sri Lanka is, or the countries that are more involved in Sri Lanka, you can't forget India and China. Japan is also a very strategic partner, but their role in the country has been, well, not very public, let's say, in the past 10 to 15 years. Much has been happening. Many projects have been initiated. The LRT project, for example, got cancelled halfway. But those countries are very involved here in Sri Lanka. So speaking about India and China, the two countries, correct me if I'm wrong, have a little bit of a love-hate kind of relationship. At times they're together on certain matters, but then at times they are on the opposite sides of the table. So with these two countries playing a major role in Sri Lanka, and it almost seems as if the two countries are trying to outdo themselves as to who is a better ally to Sri Lanka and why Sri Lanka should side with them instead of the other on many matters for that matter. So speaking of how we're dealing with this and how this has impacted us, we know that India provided us many concessions during the economic crisis. Even recently, Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar went on to claim that India has helped Sri Lanka even more than the IMF. But now we see that the statements coming out from China, or the interest shown by China in Sri Lanka, just in the past few months, maybe this is like a small hiatus, it could be, but has reduced to a certain extent. Do you think that maybe China has decided we can't help Sri Lanka as much as India can?
So the thing is, Shalan, there's a very interesting article from the Council of Foreign Relations that came out recently on how the economic recovery, post-COVID recovery of China has been heavily overestimated. And China has really not recovered a lot after the zero COVID policy. It's been about 6 months now since they've eliminated that. It's been about 6 months now since they tried to get rid of all the restrictions and things like that. But the Council of Foreign Relations report said that something like 1 in 5 Chinese youngsters between the age of 18 and 26 are unemployed. So it kind of looks bad for China in terms of them being able to build a future. Now, we've got to remember that China became an outward-looking country quite recently, right? We tend to forget this. We tend to forget that even if you grew up in the 90s, you did not consider China to be a global power. You consider China and India to be historical powers, because even in the 90s, these two nations were not global powers. It's only been in the sort of 21st century that we've had these conversations. So we have to recognize that China's economy is not as good as what is being traditionally reported, and that is one reason. The second is that the way these two nations try to win over friends is very different. And here's again an opportunity for Sri Lanka, right? If our diplomats are smart, right? Which is that China has a, as you know, policy of just pumping money into the economies of certain countries, help them build ports, help them build bridges, help them build roads, infrastructure investment, almost like what the British Empire used to do, right? Where you would go in and you would actually build pipelines and blah, blah, blah. That's the Chinese model of winning over.
But these
friends.
are all loans.
And
these are all loans, Nilanthan.
Yeah, I know, but I'm being quite sort of generous to China, right? Because I'm trying to frame the debate objectively. So now, in terms of the Indian style of doing things, it's very different, because obviously India cannot compete with the kind of money that China can just throw at countries they're trying to befriend. India simply cannot compete with China in that arena. However, India can compete with China in terms of having a global geopolitical vision, which has always been a civilizational part of India in a way that China has never been. So historically, even China has never been a country that has a very global worldview. Most Chinese kingdoms historically did not. So, for example, when Turkey had the earthquake a couple of months ago, there were Indian search and rescue teams there the very next day, despite the fact that Turkey and India are on very bad terms diplomatically. As you know, the last month in Sudan, the entire country has been embroiled in violent conflict because the two top military leaders and their factions are waging all-out war with each other on the streets. India conducted evacuation operations all the way in Sudan, and they've done this in Yemen, they've done this in Syria. India is the only country, or one of the only countries, that has very good diplomatic relations both with Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran, which very, very few countries can even say, right? So the last 10 years or so, during the Narendra Modi sort of regime, India's foreign policy has been a lot more muscular, robust, if we can use that word. And there's now a willingness to embrace Indianness in Indian foreign policy that simply wasn't there previously. If you look at Indian foreign policy from 1947 until 2014, it's what's called a Nehruvian policy, as in Jawaharlal Nehru's policy of not really embracing the nature of Indianness, whereas that script has kind of been flipped now. So right now, for the first time, India seems to be doing economically better than China, which if you had predicted before COVID, most economic experts would have thought you were mad. But of course, COVID changed a lot of things. And on a cultural, diplomatic level, India has now, over the last 10 years, been able to leverage that in ways that the Chinese have not, right? Because the Chinese do not have that kind of vision in terms of promoting their soft power. Their idea is more along the lines of, I mean, you would call it loans, I would call it pumping in money. It all means the same thing ultimately, right? But there are two very, very different ways of befriending.
So Nilanthan, of course, we will have to wait and see how these two ways pan out. Sri Lanka would be a good test case as to see which one is better. And then, of course, that clearly shows why both of these countries are very, very interested in what's happening here at home. Nilanthan, we're out of time today. We've discussed a lot of important things. We would love to have you on our show again, but unfortunately for today, our time is up. Thank you very much for joining us on Newsline. Thank you very much to all our viewers out there for tuning in. Until we meet again, take care and God bless.